stand here.
Hi, everybody, and I hope you had a wonderful Wednesday. And we want to do our Wednesday night message. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in John chapter 15, so you can go ahead and start by turning there. We're going to look at this passage about the vine and Jesus, being connected to Jesus, John 15, 1 through 11. And we also want to update some information about our missionaries. Glenetta was kind enough to call us today and give us an update. And she asked if we would share that with you guys, and we were just overjoyed to do so because, you know, you guys are wondering about what's going on with people that we support as missionaries, and it was good that we got some information. And I'm going to have Rhonda share that with you, and then she'll share a song with you also, and then I'll come back and we'll start going through John chapter 15. So I'll go ahead and let her have it now, and she'll give you a missions update, and then she has a song she wants to sing too.
Hi, good evening, everyone. First, I'll talk about the Harrisons. Elizabeth did have the COVID-19. She is better now, and she was in quarantine for 11 days, and now she's been free of fever for 72 hours. I said the Harrisons. Okay. Yeah. And they're not sure about Faith. She had a bad cold, but they didn't test her, but she's doing better as well. And Tim is doing well. He did not have it. So that's the update on the Harrisons. And now we have Jonathan in Puerto Rico. He's doing well. They have not had the virus. They've been under a tight curfew, though, and otherwise they are doing fine and working from home. Tim and at Mexico, and they're doing well. Strict curfew as well for them, and they're working from home. Their son, who is a physical therapist, had this practice, I think, within a partner, and he's had to shut down his facility. So they'll be glad to get that up and working. So if we could keep them all in our prayers, they're doing the best they can under the circumstances and trying to continue with their mission. So if we just keep them in prayer, that'd be greatly appreciated. And I am going to sing a song tonight. It's a little updated version of Be Thou My Vision. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Be thou my vision, be thou my song, be all that I long for, all I see, all I want. Be thou my focus, be thou my light, be all that I look for, as I lift up my eyes. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only be first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. Be thou my vision, be thou my song, be all that I long for, all I see, all I want. Be thou my focus, be thou my light, be all that I look for, as I lift up my eyes. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, oh bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. I love that song. It's one of my favorites. It makes me weep when I hear it because it's so it's just a wonderful message. Open your Bibles up to John chapter 15, please. And I want to look at verses 1 through 11. It's about the vine. And as you're turning there, let me give you just a little background about this from the Old Testament. It seems that, well, it is. Jesus is drawing from Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 2. And in that passage in Isaiah, the nation of Israel is called a vineyard. And it talks about how God has prepared this area of ground in order to have a vineyard, and has provided meticulous care in order to provide fruit from this crop, and it has failed him. And it's a picture of Israel and the tenuous relationship that they had with God. God was so patient with them. I mean, the vineyard imagery, anybody in that time knows that when you plant a vineyard, it takes a lot of work and effort to get the vines ready to produce. Somewhere around 7 years before you start to get a fruit from your vines. And so it's a very fitting image with what God endured with the nation of Israel. Now we get to the New Testament, and now Jesus is the vine, or we could say the vineyard, that kind of goes together there in this messaging. But Israel no longer has that metaphoric title. It's been given to Jesus. So we want to start from that viewpoint and looking at John chapter 15, 1 through 11. And one other thing I want to point out to you before we start reading this is that this is instruction strictly for followers of Jesus. This isn't a message about how you can have a relationship with Jesus or anything like that. There's other places in the Gospel of John that definitely bring that message out, or bring that the instruction out about how you can have salvation, and throughout the New Testament. But in this passage, we're just talking about followers and what Jesus expects from his followers. So let's start at verse 1, John chapter 15. And I'm going to read through verse 11. I think that's a good stopping point. So let's begin in verse 1. This is Jesus speaking. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I am him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my word abides in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments, and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. Such an interesting passage, and so direct in what it says. One of the things that jumps out when I read that passage is the reoccurrence of the word abide or remain. Your translation may have remain there. But over and over, Jesus talks about this abiding or remaining in him. It's a very, very important word in this passage. And Jesus is pretty blunt. You have to abide in him. You have to remain in Jesus, or we have to stay connected to Jesus. That's what he's saying. If that happens, if you abide in Jesus, then love, he talks about the love that you have as a parent, obviously, but there's also other things that are going to happen. Fruit. And we want to talk about that fruit coming up, what that means. It's a metaphor, but also we need to understand that with this metaphor of the vine and producing fruit, that there's also a need to remain connected to that tree, or as I said, being connected to Jesus. The branches must remain attached to any kind of plant. You guys know this as farmers, as gardeners, as just anyone that's planted flowers or anything like that. You know that the branch or petal or whatever has to remain connected to the stalk or the tree stalk itself in order to produce fruit. You cannot produce fruit if you are not connected, and it fits so well within Christianity. Christians cannot produce fruit or Christian actions, behaviors, values without that connection with Jesus Christ. So Jesus tells us, if we remain in him, something will happen. He's pretty clear about this. He's pretty forthright. If we remain in him, something will happen. He talks about fruit. So it's a metaphor. So as a vine produces fruit, as a grapevine produces grapes, Jesus' disciples should also be producing some kind of a product. So what is this? These are actions. The fruit is actions and behaviors that would be associated with Christianity, that we would draw straight from the New Testament, and only the New Testament. Yes, we have the Old Testament, and I value the Old Testament. I have a master's degree in the Old Testament studies. And I know that the New Testament is built on the Old Testament. That's why I study the Old Testament. But for Christians, our book, our Testament, is the New Testament. Can we learn valuable lessons from the Old Testament? Absolutely. Absolutely. However, for our values, our behaviors, our actions, our mindset, our attitude, we draw all instruction from the New Testament. Now, conversely, from what I said earlier about we have to remain connected in order to produce fruit, and this fruit is the actions and behaviors that would be associated with Christianity, the converse of that would be if someone's actions or behaviors do not represent Christian teaching, or what we know from the teachings of the New Testament. If they do not represent that, then I'm not saying this. Jesus is saying this. They are not his disciples. In fact, he has very, very strong wording about that, about how God has a role in this also, and he gathers these unconnected branches and destroys them. Jesus also talks to his disciples and tells them that they are pronounced clean because of the teachings of Jesus. This just reinforces this idea about where do we get our instruction. So Jesus has spent, little over 3 years with his disciples at this time. They have been instructed by him. They've been encouraged by him. He has reprimanded them at times, but they have been party to his instruction. And because of that, he has probably seen development in their lives. He's seen fruit. And because of that, he pronounces them as pure. It could be an idea of purified ones also. But they are pure because of the teachings, and they abide in those teachings. So there is an outcome for us. We think about us. There's an outcome for us when we behave in a similar way. When we obey Jesus, fruit starts to happen in our lives. We have to be connected to Jesus for things to start happening. Acknowledgement of Jesus, just saying, oh yeah, I believe in Jesus, or Jesus is a great guy and I follow him, is just not adequate. It's not adequate at all. We have to be connected, and there has to be fruit that starts to be evident in our life. We start to have fruit or produce fruit through our loving devotion to Christ. We have to be lovingly devoted to Christ. And when we are lovingly devoted to Christ, things start to happen in our lives naturally. We don't have to self-generate. We shouldn't have to think about what it is we should do. When we submit to Christ's instructions through the ministry of the Holy Spirit, when we do that, when we obey, things start to happen. Positive things start to occur. In fact, Jesus says in verse 5 that it's because of Him that we produce fruit. I think that's so critical for us to understand there. We really need to process that and think about what Jesus is actually saying there. It's not possible for us to produce fruit, Christian values, actions, behaviors, without Jesus in our life. He's pretty clear about that. Well, he also talks about God in this passage. And I want to talk about God just for a little bit because God plays an important role in this passage as Jesus instructs us. First thing is Jesus says God is the vine dresser. He is the one who's dressing the vines. So he prunes the ones that are producing fruit. Why? So that they'll produce more fruit. And I don't think we should think of this as being a negative or hurtful or anything like that. I think we should think of this as loving, tender care, actually. God tenderly cares for the branch, and it produces more fruit. However, for those that do not produce fruit, now the outcome is a little bit negative. Well, actually, it's a lot negative. Those branches are gathered up. First, they're cut off, gathered up, and they're destroyed. So God has a hand in this also, and He can help us to produce more fruit. Obviously, it's our connection with Jesus that begins the process, but God can multiply our fruit, in a sense, because of His actions in our life, tender, loving actions. However, there's a contrast to that too. When we don't produce fruit, it tells something about us. Well, from Jesus' perspective, it would be, you never were connected to me. And from God's perspective, it would be that I need to remove you so that others can take your place and produce fruit. And after I remove that branch or you will be destroyed. Now, this imagery of destruction, automatically in my head, I'm drawn back to Matthew 13. I don't like to mix the Gospels up when I'm teaching from a certain gospel, but I think it's important in this point because there's imagery here that is very, very familiar with what goes on in Matthew chapter 13. So in Matthew 13, we have two parables that are kind of mirror what's going on here. It's not an exact mirroring, but the messaging is very, very similar. It's the parable of the wheat and weeds, or you may know it as the wheat and tares, and it's also the parable of the net with the good fish and the bad fish. And what we find out in both of these parables is that there comes a time when there will be a gathering. And in that gathering, there's going to be a separation of things going on. And the good wheat will be stored or kept. And the weeds and the tares, don't mix that up with wheat. The weeds and the tares will be destroyed. In the parable of the net, some fish are good, some fish are not. Those that are not desirable will be destroyed also. Very, very similar imagery to what's going on here in John chapter 15. Branches that do not produce fruit. God, not Jesus, God destroys. God destroys those worthless branches. I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was, I have a holly tree in my backyard, and I love this tree. I just love the tree because it has those red berries on it, and Christmas time it's so beautiful. It's always green, and I always have just really been drawn to that tree. It's one of my favorites in my yard. And one spring, I remember that the tree was really looking, pitiful. It was looking very, very pitiful. It was starting to lose leaves in places, and some of the branches were bare. And I was really, really worried about this tree. And I told Rhonda that I'm going to go out and I'm going to cut off all the dead. I'm just going to cut all the dead off of it. And I did. I cut and cut and cut. It was like half a day. It was so bad. And I gathered it all up and got rid of all those dead branches. And that tree looked horrible after I was done. It just looked terrible. But about 2 months later, it started to to blossom or to leaf out again. And it started to produce new foliage. And it needed that cutting of that dead away in order that it could produce something worthwhile again. When I think of John chapter 15, I think about that also, about how that when you remove the dead from whatever, maybe a community that you're in or whatever else, that has a positive effect on that community, just like removing the dead from that holly tree ended up having a very positive effect upon the future for that tree in my yard. There's one other thing I think it's important about this passage, and it comes in verse 8. In verse 8, Jesus tells us that God is glorified through our actions. That should be our first objective in all that we do as Christians. Glorify God. And Jesus is pretty clear in this, that when we abide in Him and we produce fruit, the outcome is that God is glorified. Well, we produce the fruit because we're connected to Jesus. God sent Jesus into this world to provide salvation for us. God adores Jesus. We should adore Jesus also. And if we adore Jesus, then we adore God. And guess what? God is glorified through our actions and our behavior. So we must remain connected to Jesus. And John repeats this text, Jesus teaching here, and John records it. John repeats this over and over and over, that we have to abide, but specifically we have to abide in Jesus. Just a few more ideas that I just want you to take home with you real quick. So in that passage, Jesus is talking to his disciples. So let's just move away from the disciples and say Jesus is talking to us. So what do we get from this passage that would be beneficial for our lives? First, this is one thing I think that's really, really critical. We must prioritize our relationship with Jesus. It must be our first priority. We must prioritize our relationship with Jesus. Well, if we did that, then we would have practices in our life that would produce fruit. They would be spiritual practices that would have a very positive effect upon our spiritual growth. And you think about what Jesus said, because I'm always drawn back to this. One thing that he said is that you cannot produce fruit apart from me. I find that startling and shocking. And we think about what that means. There's no way that I can produce fruit apart from Jesus. Well, where am I going to get the nourishment that I need in order to produce this spiritual fruit or have these Christian behaviors and values? One of the things that's interesting to me when I read through the New Testament and I think about our world, and I'm just talking about the United States. I don't know about the rest of the world. I've never been outside the country, to tell you the truth. But when I think about our country, when I think about this, the instructions that we have for Christianity are the instructions of Jesus that are carried over by the apostles throughout the New Testament are diametrically opposed to secular values. I am just shocked sometimes when I hear someone talk about secular values and tries to connect that to some kind of Christian value. And I listen to them and I'm like, you're not connected to Jesus. You're not being instructed from the New Testament. Because what Jesus teaches us is diametrically opposed to what we have. Therefore, if we're not connected to Jesus, if we're not reading our Bibles daily, New Testament specifically, if we're not reading our New Testament on a regular basis, what I understand from this, what I understand from the words of Jesus, is that it's impossible for us. It's impossible for us to produce fruit. And I also think I could probably say that a person who thinks they're producing fruit that is not connected to Jesus, that's not connected to the instruction in the New Testament, they think they produce fruit, but they really don't. Their fruit is more associated with secular values because secular values are so much opposed to what is taught about Christianity in the New Testament. You know, we constantly have to refresh our minds. When I read through the Bible, I'm just amazed how God works in my life, how He refreshes my thinking about things. Because we're all affected by secular values. We can't just live in a bubble away from secularism. It's just not possible. And what makes it even more dangerous is we have some people who are basically secularists who try to claim to be Christians, which really muddies the water. Well, how do we clear up the situation? We go back to the Bible and find out what God teaches us about being a Christian. And from that, we should see fruit being produced. We should see fruit that is associated with Christian values and not our American secularized values. One other thing here. Attachment to Jesus automatically produces fruit. So we don't self-generate the fruit. Like the branch doesn't self-generate the fruit itself. We can't produce any kind of spiritual fruit in our life on our own, under our own power. Well, neither can the branch. The branch has to be connected. For us to produce this spiritual fruit, and I'm going to talk about what that fruit is here in a few minutes. For us to produce this metaphoric spiritual fruit, we have to be connected to Jesus. And when we are, it automatically happens. It should be natural that this fruit occurs. You look at a fruit tree that produces fruit naturally. It's connected and it produces fruit naturally. Well, it should be the same in our lives. These things should be naturally occurring. One of the problems I think that as Christians we get a little bit impatient and we think that there should be fruit being produced in our life instantaneously at all times. Well, that's just not the way things work. It's not that way at all. Think about a fruit tree. Does a fruit tree produce fruit instantaneously? Do you go out and look at an apple tree or an orange tree or a peach tree or blueberry bushes or blackberry vines or whatever? Do you go out and look at that plant one night and there's no fruit there, and then the next morning you're like, I'm going to go back out there and I know there's going to be fruit instantaneously? No, it doesn't work that way. And it doesn't work that way in our life either. We don't have instantaneous fruit, but Jesus promises us that if we stay connected with Him, we will produce fruit. It does take time. It does take practice. But if we stay connected, we will be fruitful. So let me talk about this fruit real quick, and I just want to close out with just one more idea. So the fruit is it's a metaphor. So what is the fruit? Well, we don't have to go anywhere except to the New Testament. That's the only place we should go to find out what fruit Jesus is talking about. And what we find out from the New Testament is that Christians should have certain qualities. They should behave certain ways. There should be things evident in our life. Generosity. We should be generous people. Why? At the root of the word grace is the idea of generosity. God is very generous to us. So we need to be generous to not only in our praise of God, that could be a generous outpouring, but also in the way that we interact with one another and share, especially with Christians. We need to be generous people. We should also be compassionate. We should be a compassionate people, having a concern for other people, loving other people, serving other people. We need to be compassionate people. We should also be peaceful people. There is no violence in the kingdom of God. In fact, we reserve all the vengeance and all that action to God. That's what Paul teaches us in Romans 13. It's also in other places too. Actually, he's quoting from a proverb when he says this in Romans chapter 13. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So we're supposed to leave it to God to take care of those things. But we're supposed to be peaceful people, and we're supposed to be kind people. There should be kindness in our life. That's fruit. There should be a striving within us for moral excellence. Now, we'll never be perfect people. Never be perfect people. But we should be striving to be better every day as we continue to refresh our mind about what it means to be a Christian. As we continue to receive that nourishment from Jesus in order to produce fruit. We should also have a cooperative spirit, working with one another. In fact, the Restoration Movement initially began as a Christian movement, desire for Christians all to come together. In fact, the leading men in the Restoration Movement at the origin, the Campbells, mainly the Campbells, strove to try to produce this unity among Christians. They saw all these different denominations, and they saw the division that was going on there and the strife that was going on there, and it's not healthy. And they looked at the prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17, and we're going to look at that prayer in a couple weeks too. How Jesus prayed that everybody would be one that follows him, yet we're not. We have to have a cooperative spirit. There are lots of people I disagree with theologically about certain issues, but most times I can set some things aside, and work with a person. There's a few essentials in my life. For me, it's really important that a person also believe that Jesus was actually an historical person. He actually lived. He actually walked in this world. He taught in this world. He died. These things are very, very fundamental for me. It's important. It's vital that someone also understand that Jesus is God. For me, there's just no other way to understand it, especially when I look at the Gospel of John and parts of Paul's writing too. Jesus is God, so he's not a created being like us. He's part of the Trinity Godhead. Also, the fact that Jesus actually was raised from the dead. These things are critical to me and my understanding. Also, the fact that he sits at a very special position right next to the Father. These things are critical for me as far as my theological core. Now, others may have some different views about structuring the church or combining churches into some kind of denominational coordination or something like that. I can overlook some of these things as long as we still have those fundamental core theological values about Jesus. And we need to be cooperative. We also need to be serving one another, doing Christian service, especially advancing the kingdom of God. These are fruits that we should be having in our lives. Now, there are many, many other fruits that we could throw into this mix too, obviously, but I think this really gets to the heart of the thing. We need to be forgiving other people too, forgiving other Christians. So kindness, compassion, being cooperative, Christian service, striving for moral excellence, forgiving other people, being willing to forgive other people, loving other people, serving God and advancing his kingdom. This is what Jesus is talking about when he refers to spiritual fruit in our lives. The last point is this. It's in verse 11. This is the way Jesus closes this section. He says that there would be joy in our life. Joy. That his joy would be within us and that we would have joy to the full. That kind of idea. We should have joy in our life, but we need to understand what that means. Joy, Christian joy, doesn't mean giddiness and just a carefree attitude or carefree lifestyle. That's not what he's talking about at all. There are times, in fact, Jesus has already talked about it in the Gospel of John, that you're going to have great difficulty, in this life because you have chosen to follow Jesus. And there are people out there who hate that. They loathe the fact that we have given our lives over to Jesus. I really don't know why they're so opposed to it. It's really ironic and strange. However, there will be difficulty in this life. Probably generates from, we could source it back to some kind of evil like Satan and other things like that, obviously. But basically, people are, for the most part, they really don't know how to act appropriately until they do become a Christian and what it means to live according to some kind of moral guidance. So you can expect all kinds of things from people who are not connected to Jesus. Horrible things happen, and it affects us. So sometimes our life can be extremely, extremely difficult. So Jesus isn't talking about a giddy, carefree life. What he's talking about, the joy, knowing. This is the joy that we know that if we stay connected to Jesus, not only do we produce fruit, not only do we glorify God, but guess what else? We have everlasting life. That's where our joy comes from, knowing that we have life after this life, and it goes on forever. Let me recap just real quick, and I can do it very, very simply. As a Christian, we have to remain connected to Jesus. How do we do that? We need to practice We need to have spiritual practices in our life, Bible study, prayer, going to church. Then these things produce things in us. Fruit, spiritual fruit, metaphoric fruit, kindness, so many other things, compassion, the ability to forgive other people, Christian service, striving for moral excellence. These things happen in our life. But in order for these things to happen, we have to be connected to Jesus. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you had a wonderful, wonderful Wednesday. I want to continue to encourage you to pray. I am personally, I am in awe of all the medical personnel that are just out there on a daily basis, just putting their lives in a position of danger. I mean, they're putting themselves in danger every day when they go out and they try to confront people who have contracted this horrible, horrible virus. And I'm awed at their courage that they go out and do this on a regular basis just to help people. And I'm moved when I see on the news doctors and nurses in a prayer circle praying before their shift starts or praying in the middle of their shift. It just moves me to see these people, these well-trained and educated people, relying upon God to enhance their medical abilities and to provide some kind of asking for guidance and help in their battle for this virus. So keep those people in your prayers. You know, we're thinking about police officers. They're involved in this too. Firemen, paramedics, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, x-ray technicians, anybody you can think of that's working in the medical field. We have got to blanket those people with prayer. Why? Because they are so courageous. They are so courageous. And I'm so thankful for all that they do. So please keep those people in prayer. Also, keep praying about God just completely healing this world of this virus. So we want to keep praying about that also. Again, thank you very much. Keep our missionaries in prayer also. And let's just keep on thinking positive about this. It is difficult, but we will overcome this at some point. We just need to stay disciplined right now and look to a better tomorrow. It will come, I promise you. But we just need to be good people right now. Good people, followers of Christ, producing fruit in our lives and being prayer warriors during this time. Thank you very much, and may God bless you and keep you.